So welcome to everybody, good morning. Thank you for the introduction, John, to the conference. I'm Pierre Pinson, I'm the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Forecasting, and I've been given the honor to introduce the first plenary speaker and to chair this session. It's really a pleasure and an honor, as I just said, to welcome Yael Grushka-Cockayne. She's a professor at University of Virginia, Darden School of Business, and she's also been a visiting professor at Harvard Business School. She's an associate editor for management science and operations research. She's published many super interesting works, and I've understood that she's going to tell us all about it. Some of the past works, some of the recent works, and some of her very special ideas. So we are all looking forward to hearing what Yael has to say. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Pierre, for that welcome. Everybody hear my mic okay? Yeah? Okay, good. I see some thumbs up. Hopefully folks at home can hear it okay as well. Maybe we can get a thumbs up from them too. Can folks see me writing on my board as well? Yeah? Okay, good. There's going to be maybe a little bit of a delay with technology and Zoom land, but we'll make it fun, right? Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for organizing this beautiful conference room. It's great to be in a room where you look around and you immediately feel underdressed compared to some of the outfits that they wore. And if we think it's hot today, at least we can get some solace that we don't have to wear all those layers that they seem to be wearing in those pictures, but it's inspiring nonetheless. I'm here to talk about communicating uncertainty. As Pierre mentioned, my name is Yael Grushka-Cockayne. I'm a professor at the University of Virginia, Darden School of Business in Charlottesville. I want to stress that because guess what's happening next year? Next year, all of you are going to be our guests in Virginia because we are honored to host the ISF 43rd conference, and of course it will be hard to top this location, but a lot of exciting things are planned, so I'm excited about that. This is one of my first times presenting at the ISF, so I am especially honored. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about some work that I've done in the past and some current ongoing work in progress. So hopefully you'll find it interesting. We'll try to make it interactive, and I look forward to your thoughts and comments afterwards because we always learn from every single presentation. So I'm going to start with the following image. Some of you may remember these types of images. This one is taken from Vox media outlet. This is around May 2020. Maybe this brings back fond memories, probably not to anybody in this room. I suspect it brings back kind of horrific thoughts about the uncertainty that existed back in the day in May 2020. This is Dr. Deborah Birx. She was the White House COVID Special Task Force Coordinator. And this is an image of her seemingly discussing the uncertainty that exists in the predictions. This is a very specific model prediction. This is the IHME model. I'm not going to talk too much about the model itself. That's a whole other conversation, which I'm sure a lot of folks in this room have something to say about. But she was referring to a specific set of uncertainties related to daily deaths predicted at the time. This was April, May of 2020. And why I bring this image up is to really focus on a few things. First, these types of confidence intervals and these types of kind of gray regions on charts were becoming more and more common in the popular press. Vox even made a statement to, in their article covering this image that said the following, and I'm going to wait just to make sure that you guys can follow with me the statement once it shows up. Zoom is a little bit slow. Maybe I'll just read it to you while you're waiting. So the statement in the article said that an analysis found that the next day death predictions for each state were outside its 95th confidence interval 70% of the time. Meaning, whoops. Well, that shouldn't have happened, but it did. We will get it sorted. It's the Wi-Fi. Yeah, it's all in there, but of course it didn't happen until now. You want to start it while I continue?
You carry on, yeah.
So the sentence that I'll read out while we're getting reconfigured basically said that 70% of the time, the predictions, the realizations fell outside of the confidence interval, 70% of the time, which of course was way too high, meaning that the predictions from the model were way too narrow. Now, we all know that, but what's so fascinating was that this type of information was being communicated to the general public. And what I'm going to pose, my question is, how are decision makers, how is the general public supposed to react and intended to react to these types of sets of information? In fact, if you dig in and you look at the information that was given on the various websites, are we getting there?
Not yet, sorry, I apologize.
That's okay. Is it connected? We can do it. We can do it. Okay, as we wait and I improvise, I'm going to actually kind of pause a question for you all, okay? I'm going to get some voices engaged as I'm buying time to get my screen back up. But one of my questions to you all is that when we go out to communicate uncertainty to the general public, what is the goal of communicating uncertainty? What is the aim? Why do we put out, why do organizations like, for instance, the White House task force related to COVID, the COVID special task force, why do they show these confidence intervals? What are they trying to articulate? Yes, go for it. How difficult is the forecasting task? Why would they want to communicate that? Why would that be a goal of communicating uncertainty, to say, this is a really hard task? So we all get like some respect. Tell me more. Okay, beautiful, yes.
Honestly communicate what it is that we know and don't know.
Okay, why would that be important when you're communicating to somebody like the general public?
So first of all, because they're not making decisions. Second, because trust in science and forecasting is best enhanced by being honest about when it is that you know something.
Okay, so this is a lot about the forecaster. Notice the comments that we're hearing is that we're aiming to communicate uncertainty because we're communicating how hard the task is. We're communicating, how real what is our real level of knowledge, something about the scientific discovery. We are doing something to express our level of uncertainty. This has nothing to do with the decision makers and what they're supposed to do. We're expressing something about our own capability. I'm just picking up on these comments. Yes? Okay, beautiful. So we're hedging. We're trying to communicate that people don't pin us down to one number. Yes, another example. Tell us more.
Because we want to not lose trust. We want to show the public what it's about and have them with us on the journey and not lose them on the way. And this way,
Just copy it over to there.
they will not mistrust in us. Them how to do this. And they expect not us to 100%, but they give us then some flex.
Yeah, there's a lot of implications here, a lot of comments and thoughts about what we as forecasters are trying to do to communicate the uncertainty. Yes? Okay, we're informing about the risk, but what do we expect the audience to do? We are thinking a lot about the forecasters and less about the challenges related to the decision makers. Yes? Okay, beautiful. So we have all of these ideas here. We have some challenges. We're getting this sorted, guys, I promise you. Are we copying it over?
About to, yeah.
Just about to. Thank you, James. We appreciate your help. You want me to do it? Yeah, that's fine.
Fine.
I can do it. Sorry, everybody.
No, and you carry on talking.
Yeah, it's okay. Did it not? Oh, there it is. Okay, we got this. We got this. We got this. We got this. We almost got this. Okay, so here was the famous statement that we heard of. We also saw that this is the type of information that appears on a regular basis on the website. This is the website for the IHME site, where you can get all the download, all the information from all of their models, all of their predictions. And every time you can choose, but you can choose to see this cloud, this kind of uncertainty region. This is the information that is being presented with it, okay? So they tell us, and this is the kind of text and context that they're providing to the general public. Uncertainty is the range of values that is likely to include the correct projected estimate for a given data category. Larger uncertainty intervals can result from limited data, small studies, and conflicting information. And smaller uncertainty intervals can result from extensive data availability, large studies, and data that is consistent across sources. The model presented in this tool has a 95% confidence interval and is represented by the shaded areas on each chart. That is what information we, as forecasters, whoever is involved, communicate. This is an example of how we communicate it out to those decision makers that we heard of and we thought of in terms of what they're supposed to do. We're trying to communicate risk. We're trying to communicate to hedge. We're trying to articulate how challenging our forecasting task is. And we're expecting for folks to interact and understand what to do with this. Decision makers, those planning hospital beds, those planning various needs for resourcing, those who are planning different courses of action, and a lot of you in the room need to react and use this information in a creative way. Okay, we talked a little bit about the goals. I'm not going to board it. I was going to put everybody's comments here, but I will add your insightful comments after to make sure that we kind of make up for time. And let's talk a little bit about the challenges. Why is it challenging to communicate the uncertainty that we have in our models? Like, do we feel that these types of communications are satisfying? Do we feel that people know how to react to them? Okay. I'm seeing some heads nod no. Not a lot of heads nod no. What do we think? What are some challenges with communicating uncertainty properly? Why is it so challenging? Why is it so challenging? So those who do forecasting might use a different language to describe the uncertainty than those who use those forecasts, regardless of if it's in the business world, if it's in the public sector, whatever the sector is, it's a different type of languages. Okay, good. Give me another example for a challenge. Yes. Yeah, you're trying to hedge. It's a really challenging task. You're trying to kind of make sure that you're doing the scientific process, but it's not helpful. So there's this notion that it's very challenging to communicate. Good. Maybe one more reason in the back there. One more reason. One more reason it's challenging. We all know the challenges. Yes.
No one likes uncertainty.
No, nobody likes it. Nobody likes it, especially under these types of conditions where it's life and death. People want certainty. Here's a few more nuanced challenges to add to the conversation. So, when we go back a few years ago, Bob Winkler, Casey Lichtenthal, and I wrote a paper that talked about aggregating forecasts. I'm not so much focusing on the aggregation part, but what was so interesting is that in that paper we show that when we're aggregating distributional forecasts, okay, a complete distribution, which expresses some uncertainty, we did also notice that it's not trivial if you average probabilities or if you average quantiles. It turns out this results in a different distribution, in a different aggregated distribution. This, more than the fact that it was kind of a nice finding about aggregation, and the focus of the paper was really which performs well under which circumstance, what was so fascinating about that project is that we learned that actually the intuition that these aggregation processes are different was not trivial. It surprised us, it surprised those who read the paper, and it turned out that even experts didn't have a great intuition to the fact that just the way in which we average probabilities may not result in the same ultimate probability distribution. Great. So that's one challenge. Another paper that we worked with Victor, who might be here, Casey and I worked with Victor, is that we showed that actually, again, if you take a few probability distributions and you aggregate them, interior trimming and exterior trimming are not the same. They result in a different prediction and a different aggregated forecast. And in addition to that, we showed that the method in which you aggregate, so whether you're aggregating predictions using a mean approach, or whether you're aggregating method using what's called a CDF approach, so you're looking at CDF values as you go along, all of these different choices result in a fundamental different aggregate, a different distribution. It was non-trivial and not intuitive to us how these things are going to come together and what the resulting distribution would be. And so we saw that actually even us as experts found that it wasn't necessarily always intuitive what the final result would look like. In addition to those challenges, so that's one set of challenges, and I'll summarize these challenges in a moment, we also have been exploring the notion of assessment through three-point estimates. So this is a different project. Victor and I are working with Jacob Rich and Jack Soll, and this is a project that looks at communicating uncertainty through three-point estimates in many different settings. I know that we all in the room know that it's quite convenient to collect three-point estimates, either subjective assessments or sometimes even machine learning assessments. And what's interesting is that when you look at these types of assessments through three-point estimates to articulate uncertainty, then you notice a few things. And we looked at a few domains. So we looked at domains related to basically submissions by about 1,000 CFOs. This is a survey that is run by Duke, by a professor, John Graham at Duke. And he asks CFOs every quarter for many, many years, worst case scenario about the returns of their firm, best case scenario, he asked them about the S&P, he asked them about themselves, and we look at their three-point estimates. We also look at three-point estimates from the M4, and actually since then we can look at the M5 because the M competitions now collect these kinds of point estimates, three-point estimates, so we can look at these prediction intervals. So we look at point estimates provided by machine learning and statistical models. We also look at three-point estimates that were given by subjects in a lab, in a subjective type of assessment process. Here we asked individuals to assess a min, a max, and a most likely for the age of these individuals that we see on the screen. We also asked a bunch of individuals to do a similar kind of assessment of prices of cars based on the pictures that you see on the screen here. And what's so fascinating is that when you look across all of these types of three-point estimates, which seems like a very natural task and a natural way for folks to express uncertainty, you see that using a very simple measure of skewness, really something that is centered around 0.5, right skewed over 0.5, left skewed under 8.5, you see that with the M4 data, which is model-driven, machine-driven, statistical model-driven, you see that for CFO data, secondary data given by the professor from Duke, you see that in the lab, the majority of the estimates that are given most frequently when you ask people for three-point estimates, and I know that a lot of people in the room have experimented with this too, what you get is pretty symmetric. People actually don't intuitively go very non-symmetric. Sometimes the model bakes in certain symmetry assumptions, and so you end up getting expressions of uncertainty that are, first, they're biased in some way, but they're often tend to be pretty symmetric and standard, which doesn't always fully capture the uncertainty that you face, okay? And so if you put all of these together, we're left with a list of uncertainties in addition to the challenges that you guys mentioned, a list of challenges in communicating uncertainty. Some of them are that it's hard for non-experts to really totally understand our expressions of uncertainty. They can't always understand what we intend for them to do with these uncertainties that we're conveying to them with the language that we've developed for us. Even experts in the field sometimes lack some intuition to how exactly the uncertainty is going to shape out. Subjective and model assessments make crude assumptions. They tend to use normal, they tend to use symmetry, they tend to use very crude and rough approximations in order to make their assessment. And in general, there is a lack of trust, and we talked about trust before. There is a lack of trust in those confidence intervals. There's a lack of trust in our expression of uncertainty. There's this notion that we sometimes report very narrow uncertainty because we're trying to gain trust, or we report too broad of an uncertainty because we're trying to hedge. All of those problems imply that there's going to be a lack of trust in the person communicating the uncertainty, and there's going to be a struggle to convey that uncertainty properly. So far, how are we doing? Are we back on track, audience? I feel like we're still not woken up completely. Okay, I think we're making good progress. I'm getting some thumbs up. People are still with me. What I'm going to do now is, that is a little bit of a prelude, kind of a setup, to say, let's look at a couple of domains. I'm going to give you a couple of examples from 2 domains. We're going to focus on how uncertainty gets discussed and conveyed and how it becomes useful in 2 contexts, okay? The first context that I'm going to use is the context of the NFL. So the National Football League, I know it's the wrong term for football, okay? So apologies. This is the American football, not what everybody else in the world calls football. But the NFL is, it's a big industry, okay? They spend about $200 million a year on player purchasing. And one of the tasks that they have to work with here is that before they recruit their players, what's called a draft, okay? Some of you may know more about it. I'm not a big football fan, so I'm going to use very basic terms here to describe the data and the uncertainty. What they do every year is they have a draft, and they have to rank their players, and they have to choose which player do we go for, okay? And so in order to determine that, how do they go about it? They're going to have to forecast. They're going to have to make some statements about what they think each player is going to do, how successful are the players going to be, okay? And so they have a process, and we can think of examples of other industries and other contexts in which a similar process occurs. You have to choose individuals for a certain job, you're not sure how successful they're going to be, and you have to figure out how to assess them. Okay, examples, do we have examples of other contexts in which we do this? What are some other contexts in which we do this? Other contexts in which we do this? College admissions of students, okay? We have to understand how successful they're going to be. Another example of where you have to assess an individual success before they join your firm. New product introductions, how successful will the product be? How successful will the hire be? There's multiple examples. So assume for a second that we're going to assess the prediction related to player X. How good is player X is going to be? What we do is, colleges might do this, hiring committees might do this, product innovation teams might do this. We go out and we get assessments from, in this industry, we get assessments from scouts. The scouts go out and they give us some kind of grade. They rank the players. They give us some kind of assessment. And these assessments, A through L, different buckets, different categories, these are categorical, discrete assessments of how well a player will do. For instance, I'll run with the example of player X. Here are some assessments given. There were 14 assessments by 14 scouts to say this is how well we think player X is going to do. However, you may ask, where's the uncertainty? Where's the uncertainty here? Okay. Well, it turns out that if you look historically, these grades, these categorical grades, if I look at it, we can actually see how successful they were when we look compared to a realization. We measure them against some kind of realization. And this is where we look at, the grades, those buckets, serve as a prediction of how successful a player will be. And we measure it against what we see in the future will turn out to be their second contract. They get recruited on the draft, and then they get renewed a few years later, typically about 4 years later. And that second contract is some kind of measure of how well they did. And we rank it as a percentage of cap. We think about it as a percentage of the entire bucket of money that a team has to spend on their players. If you occupy a high percentage of the cap, you are considered a rock star player, a superstar player. If you don't have a second contract, if you're not even renewed, that's a disappointment, okay? You were not doing very well. And so we use these, and this is already a continuous scale, this is already a range, and now we can start to look historically and try to assess for each of those grade buckets that scouts came up with, what actually is the historical uncertainty that exists within that bucket. And so this is what we did, and this is what the project entails. We looked at historical data from one team, one NFL team. We looked at it over 12 years, evaluating over 64,000 players, over 64,000 forecasts of about 13,500 players by 90 scouts. So a big data set evaluating historically how these grade buckets mapped to reality. What was the actual percentage of cap that fell within? And what you see here is that the buckets, okay, if you look at the sequencing of the buckets up here from A to L, it pretty much actually came out in some kind of order in terms of these red lines are the mean of each one of these buckets, okay? And so if we see here the average percentage cap value for each of these buckets, but of course underneath the average, there's an entire distribution within each one of the buckets, okay? And so you start to get a sense that each one of these grade buckets actually represents an entire distribution of potential outcomes for a player. So now what we can do is we can actually go and we can actually say, okay, for player X, these were the predictions that were given. And as a reminder, we had one prediction of B, one of D, one of E, 10 of F, and one of G. So we had these various predictions come in. What can we do with this? Well, we have tools, we know how to aggregate. We can aggregate these predictions together to come up with basically an aggregated prediction distribution for how well player X is going to be. So we're getting from discrete categorical buckets to something that is articulating a little bit more the sense of a distribution, of an uncertainty. Yes, I can rank a player at a certain level, but there's a lot of uncertainty that that player brings with them to the table. We can actually also come up with empirical CDFs for each one of the buckets. That's going to be very useful. And ultimately, we can start to use this in a creative way. And this is where I'm starting to hone in on the communicating uncertainty in a useful way for the general managers of these teams, for the people, the decision makers in the league. Now we can look at it and we can start comparing three players, not only assessing the uncertainty that exists in players X profile, but also to understand the uncertainty that exists in player Y or player Z's profile and assessments and some of the forecasts that come with each one of these players. Okay, is that still useful? What can we do with this now? What can we do with this now? Some kind of thresholding. Okay, so maybe we can start to come up with some kind of thresholding to say we'll only go after a player if they have a certain cumulative distribution above of a certain percentage of cap, for instance. Good. What else could we do with this? What might we do with this type of information? There's a lot of information here. What else could we do with this? Well, we can do something that maybe seems pretty obvious to folks in this room, but it's very helpful. We can start simulating, right? We can actually start to simulate and say, well, here's a potential draw. This is a potential outcome, a potential reality for these three players. In this case, if I do this one single draw, well, in this case, what do I see? I see that actually player X came out on top. He turned out to be the better player, but that's just one simulation iteration, okay? So of course, we can run this simulation multiple times. We can run it many, many different times. And after many iterations, we can come up with statements that start to be probabilistic statements that compare these players to each other. We are saying that player X is 53% of the time the better player of the three compared to the other two. And we're starting to help the leaders and the managers of this team come up with a ranking in how they want to go about drafting these players. We're starting to articulate the uncertainty in a much more concrete and action-oriented way than we would have beforehand. We can also look at, so if we think about the comparison between three players, that's typically within a year. I'm looking at three players that I may or may not recruit during that year. And then I can also look at comparisons across years, and I can start to say, okay, what is the percentage, what is the chance that my player is going to be a bust, a role player, a starter, or a superstar? Superstar category is especially sought after category. These are players that really get high, very high second contracts, and these are the ones that we really want to chase, okay? And we can see what is the percentage of second contracts that have these types of players and these types of profiles in them. So the final assessment, or the final way in which this information gets digested, and the final way in which we put it all together, is that we rank the players, X, Y, and Z. We come up with a ranking. This is useful for the team during the draft. This is what they're going to follow in terms of how attractive each player is going to be for them. And we provide them all of these probabilistic statements to convey the uncertainty that exists in each one of the players. We provide them with 3 different probabilities between year comparisons and within year comparisons. What's the chance that they're going to be a bust, a starter, or a superstar? What's the chance that they're going to be the best or the top 2 player? It turns out that from our experience working with this specific team, the probability of a superstar was really the most important information here. This is what they were chasing. And this is information that, without conveying the uncertainty completely, without understanding the distributional information, without moving from those categorical buckets to a continuous space, we couldn't have answered. So this is how the information ultimately got resolved. And if I go back and I try to kind of put this together in terms of conclusions for communicating uncertainty, we see here that historical outcomes can be used. We know that. It's very helpful to remind us. Translating these grades into historical distributions and combining them really gave us a full picture of uncertainty here, okay? Allowing us to compare the players to each other and really understand how the uncertainty helps us to create these action-oriented choices, player X or Y or Z, was really fundamental for their ability to put this uncertainty, to utilize this uncertainty in some kind of creative way, to really give them a leverage beyond just looking at a bunch of grades for a certain player. Okay? So far, any questions about that before I move to a different example? Questions? Yes, Pierre. Yeah, I'll go after.
Very quickly, because here when you simulate, you assume some kind of independence and no, let's say, cultural latent bias in your scouts, right?
Okay, beautiful. So you're assuming that the players are independent. You're not creating a team and simulating them. And the scouts, and creating a simulation. Yes, that is very true. The scout assessment in there is some kind of expression of how they will perform on this specific team. So the scouts are catered to think about it. The scouts themselves are pretty correlated, it turns out, among each other. So we tested that too. But in the simulation, they're assumed to be independent at that point. Okay, good. The woman in the back, yeah? Great minds think alike. Okay, beautiful. Yes? Beautiful. So the question was, and I'll repeat it, the question was, how did the decision makers receive this information? It's all good and well for us to look at the distributions and to understand where they came from and how we dealt with it. Indeed, they appreciated the ability to go through the process, understand that we use the historical realizations related to percentage of cap, that we came up with a distribution in order to answer the probabilistic questions, but ultimately they wanted those P's. They wanted that probability of superstar, especially that one, but the others were useful too. They wanted us to distill this information to a number that they could put on every player's card, so to speak, okay? And so that they found extremely useful, and there was nowhere to, you had to go through the whole process to get there, okay? Beautiful. One more question, and then we're going to move to the next example. Yes?
I was wondering if there was any bias in the data, because the players that are ranked very lowly are not drafted at all in the end.
So there wasn't much bias in the data per se. There is a big spike in the data of folks that do not get renewed. There's a big percentage of the players that don't get a second contract, okay? So there's like a discontinuity there because there's a big spike at 0, and then everybody that gets renewed typically has something, some percentage of cap, okay? So it was a bit tricky to deal with, but there wasn't necessarily a bias there, okay? It's just a non-symmetric kind of distribution. Beautiful, great questions. I'm going to continue with another example, and then we'll put these two things together after I bring this other context. So a very different context, okay? So I'm going to take you from America, from American football, not real football, American football, to a very different context. We are now in a different part of the world. We are now in Thailand, okay? This is going to be a very different type of example, but bear with me, I will bring it home to connect the dots, okay? So, any of you watched the movie The Rescue on I think it's on Disney? Has anybody seen the movie? or hear about this story about the cave? So I'm going to remind you a little bit about a story that took place 4 years ago. Actually, 4 years ago, today what? Today is the 11th. So yesterday would have been exactly the 4th year anniversary of, and I'm going to kind of cut to the punchline a little bit, of the saving of all of these kids. Yesterday, July 10th, was the day in which all of these kids and their coach came out of the cave safely after this ordeal that took place over several weeks. So maybe you recall, but if not, I will remind you. And I'll just point out that there's a couple of cases that I wrote on it if you're interested, that in June 2018, 12 boys and their coach went missing in Thailand, in northern Thailand, in the Chiang Mai area, okay? It was a Saturday. They went biking after a soccer practice. I'm keeping the football motif, I guess. And they got trapped in a cave in northern Thailand. The days went by, and really no information was coming out. They were still lost. 2 days later, the team was growing. More people were showing up there in terms of the rescue team. The local governor got involved. A bunch of the authorities showed up, but still no sign of the boys, okay? They were stuck in the cave. I have these day by day chronologically, but really the spirits, people were praying, religious leaders were showing up, people were hoping that the boys were alive, but this was 5-6 days later when they still were not found, no sign of life. Does anybody recall this? Yeah? Okay. Do you recall reading about it and how you felt and how it was kind of getting worse and worse day by day, the notion that we don't even know if these kids are alive? As the time went by, more individuals got involved, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the main players, but we had local players. It started very regional. So the first person to notice that the boys were missing was the park ranger, the deputy park ranger in this resort where they went into the cave. He called his park ranger, then they called the local governor. By then it was evening time, and the parents of the kids started to notice that they're not home as well, so the local residents start to come. Ultimately, after about a day or so, maybe 24 hours, by chance, somebody said, well, I know this random individual that lives in this area, Vern Unsworth, and he's an expert. He's obsessed with this cave. He knows this cave. Let's bring him and have him part of the team because he's drawn maps of the cave. So Vern gets invited. The day or two later, the Thai Navy SEALs get invited because what happens is that people were going into the cave, and the reason they couldn't find them is that they were facing rising levels of water. This is late June in Thailand. There was a bunch of rain early on in the season. Monsoons typically start a little bit later in July, but the water levels within the cave were rising. And so individuals who have no expertise were trying to go into the cave, but they were faced with very bleak, dark, muddy, water that they couldn't swim through, they couldn't dive through because it was very hard to navigate. So people were going in, but getting sent out, going in, making it through to chamber 3, a bit further, going back out. They couldn't progress, and that's why they couldn't figure out where these boys are. They couldn't penetrate it and go further. And so Vern was there, the Navy SEALs were there because maybe they knew how to help with their diving capabilities. Then that we start to see international teams joining. 7 days later, time is running out. There is still no sign of these boys. At this point, we have hundreds and hundreds of people, all the international press is there. By this point, we have the US Special Forces from Japan were flying in. Major Derek Anderson and Charles Hodges were involved, and they led a team of experts that know how to deal with these kinds of emergency situations. And at this point, a few days later, so about the 26th, 27th of June, we're also hearing from Vern, we need professional experts. We need actually people from the UK. We need Rick Stanton and John to come and to serve and to really help us because they are the world experts in cave diving. And so an international team with a bunch of experts comes together in Thailand to try and resolve the problem. These are the boys that are still missing and still their whereabouts are unknown. This is how the cave looks. That's the entrance, number 1. They were able to make it approximately to where it says there are 3, that's chamber 3, and then all of those very narrow tunnels were filled with water and it was impossible to pass. The uncertainty at this point, so this range between July 23rd when they got lost and June 23rd and July 2nd when you'll hear about what happened, the questions that we faced and the uncertainty was high. They didn't know if the boys were alive. They didn't know what the conditions they were in. Are they eating? Are they drinking? Are they scared? We didn't know where in the system of the caves they were, so how far could they have gone? Maybe they found another way out. We didn't know where there was problems with the water because nobody was able to get through there. Nobody knew when the monsoons would actually exist, and nobody knew exactly what else we're gonna find in the cave, so what other skills are involved. So we got diving experts, we got military experts, we got Navy SEAL experts, we have pumps. Chevron is there with pumps. Big drilling companies are there with big drilling devices, trying to drill holes in the mountain to get other alternative entries, various skill sets, everything coming together. We have Vern Unsworth, which I mentioned, we have the Thai Navy SEALs, and at some point, as I mentioned, we're bringing in John Volvan and Rick Stanton and Rob Harper, who stayed there for a few days to come to bear. These are the British divers who I spoke to quite a bit and interviewed for this case, and these are them on site when they arrived. A lot of uncertainty still ensues, and the local people don't really understand exactly who they are and what they're going to do. As the days went by, we finally have the moment of relief. And hopefully I've built up the drama quite enough that everybody feels a little bit better right now. July 2nd, the boys are found. Rick and John stumble upon them in a day after a big day of rain. They were almost about to turn back and go back to the UK because they were giving up. And on July 2nd, they found all 13 kids, or the 12 kids and their coach, who's about 25, and everybody's healthy, and they're in good spirits, and they're communicative. And yes, they're hungry and they're tired, and they were hoping to get out sooner, but they were found safe and secure. And now is where I want you to think as forecasters, okay? Now we have to understand there is a lot of uncertainty that still exists, okay? Because what are some questions on our mind? What uncertainty now do we have? I told you of all the uncertainty until this point. What uncertainty do we have now? Can we get all of them out alive, okay? How would you get them all out alive? What would be the best way to get them out alive? What other uncertainties exist? How much time do we have before the monsoons are gonna come, okay? What else could we do? What other uncertainty, where else do we have uncertainty here? There's a lot of uncertainty in this situation. What other uncertainty do we have? Yes? Yeah, are they good enough help? Think what it needed. Who could dive there? Who could get there? These two individuals, of all the hundreds and thousands of people, two individuals were capable and had the skills to get there. These boys were in the cave for 10 days with no food and drink. Could they get out? They didn't even know how to swim. Thai Navy SEALs could not get all the way to where they were. They were past Chamber 9 if we go back on the map. And so now we had to evaluate certain options. Now we had to decide, what do we do to take them out? Oxygen was low and running out, and the monsoons were coming. 3 specific options were being proposed. One is to dive the boys out. One is to pump and drain the water, and in the meantime, let the boys sit in there and wait. That could be several months. And the third option was to drill an alternative entry point and to save them that way. One of the key points of all of this is to tell you a little bit about the communication of uncertainty, because at the end of the day, this is what made the difference. This is what allowed this story to end, to come to a conclusion. And the way that this was done is that if you interview these experts, so Derek Anderson, he comes from the US military, he talks about the fact that if we get half of the boys, this is how he communicated what he understood the situation to be. If we get half of the boys alive, it would be a success. If we leave them in there, if we wait and pump the water and leave them in there, they're all gonna die. Oxygen is gonna run out, they will the water will eventually rise, they will die. So our best chance is to save some of them, by trying to get them out. There is no zero risk option. We can save some or none. These were the comparisons. This is how the information was conveyed. At some point, the idea of diving them out, well, they can't swim. They're not a physical condition to swim. They don't know how to swim, and they definitely cannot do cave diving, which is very hard to do. So the idea was that they were going to sedate the boys. You're going to sedate them, put them in a suit, and put them underwater to take them out. I mean, it sounds unbelievable. And the only person who was qualified to even comprehend this was Professor Harris, Richard Harris. He's from Australia, and he happens to be one of the world's best cave divers and a very talented anesthesiologist. So he understands this. I mean, what is the chances of having this combination of skills? So when he was asked initially, he said absolutely not. This is too risky. It cannot be done. This was his initial reaction. This is his expression of the risk. This is his expression of what it would do. And then to get the final approval, after he thought about it and assessed the alternatives, he recognized that he had to be a little bit more optimistic because there was no other option. He couldn't turn his back on the boys, and he said, while this was unbelievably unrealistic, it was the best shot that they had. So even he became less pessimistic and was willing to take the risk. From Rick Stanton's perspective, one of the two British divers, he's a firefighter in his daily life. He lives in the Midlands here in the UK, and he saw the situation slightly different in terms of how he expressed the risk. And putting all of this together, the decision was that they are going to save these boys through diving them out, sedating them and diving them out. And over 3 days, with a pretty comprehensive set of choices that I'll show in a moment, what they decided to do is sedate the kids, and every day they rescued 4 kids, so they balanced it out over days. 4 expert divers were tied to 1 boy at a time. It took them 3 hours to dive between chamber 9 and chamber 3, and at chamber 3 they passed the kids off to another team that was able to take them out. The divers had the capability to give them a top-up of the sedation if they needed to, but the idea was that if the kids were knocked out, they would be able to not move and just not stress out through this process and come out on the other side. Miraculously, I will say, as I said initially, all were saved and nobody died along the way. There was 1 casualty that came from the Thai Navy SEALs, which was very unfortunate, but none of the kids died in the process. This is imagery of the process, and you can see the divers with the boys on the stretcher inside of the diving suit with special masks that they were fitted. You can see them along the way topping them up if needed, and at the end, from chamber 3, they were taken out on these conveyors. So, as I bring this to a close and I kind of wrap it up to what I've been talking about all along today, this is about communicating uncertainty. And in this context, the discussions between July 2nd, what you may have noticed there is that the rescue occurred on July 8th through 10th. The boys were found on July 2nd. Okay? That means July 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th, the boys are still in the cave, the world knows they're safe, and everybody outside is waiting to do something. And those 5 days were crucial in terms of how they went about deciding what exactly the course of action is going to be and conveying it to the decision makers, which was ultimately the highest authority in the country. In order to do that, the various roles, so the divers themselves were, again, they saw less danger because they had the expertise. The doctor who sedated them saw more danger because he understood the risks of sedation. Every expert had their perspective, and it was framed in the context of the options. What are the alternatives? Uncertainty on its own, if you looked at each option on its own, it would not express what is the best course of action because you had to compare the uncertainty across the options. And it turned out that diving them out was the least risky of the 3. Once they decided and identified the risks, they could deal with it. They could plan for it. They spent July 6th, and the decision was taken July 6th. July 7th was spent practicing, walking through the process, doing a rehearsal of concept in a swimming pool with equal weighted, kind of similar sized boys, practicing in the car park, and really putting together a detailed project plan. So as I come to a close and I leave a few minutes for final questions, here's how I see the Thai cave situation with the NFL example, with the preamble discussion that I put up front, all come together. When we're communicating uncertainty, while it's very natural for us to put us as the forecasters in the center of the process, it might be useful at some point to turn it around and to think about the decision makers. What are we expecting them to do? And how can we articulate the uncertainty in a useful way for the decision makers to take action based on the uncertainty that we know exists in any situation? And so in all of these situations, it turns out that An effective way is through these comparisons of course of action. If it's in the NFL setting, this has to do with each player. So I'm comparing player X to Y to Z, and it allows me to think about those players in a more concrete way. In the Thai case, in the Thai cave situation, it's the options that we really have in terms of saving the boys. And then in the case of COVID, the uncertainty, if you recall, conveying uncertainty about our predictions was only so useful because people felt overwhelmed by bad information. But once we moved to a very concrete comparison, the flattening of the curve situation where we're comparing one action to a different set of actions, social distancing, shutdown, no shutdown. Once we gave opportunities for people to understand that there's a decision to be made in order to take action that affects the uncertainty, people were able to understand it better. So decision-oriented mindset really helps, the decision is what helps us understand the uncertainty even better and take some action related to it and really comprehend it in a digestible way. So I'm going to pause there. Sorry for the technical difficulties. I hope we were still able to take something out of this talk. I have a few minutes left, I think, Pierre, for questions. And maybe we can even see if there's some questions online, because we get to get some folks online involved. Thank you, everybody.
Are there questions? There's a microphone here. Try to be as fast.
Hi, Jethro Barrell, University of Glasgow. Thanks for a really interesting talk. I wonder if you could comment on how the uncertainty in forecasts being communicated impacts people's appreciation of the uncertainty in the decision they're trying to make. Is there a danger that people might think, well, I've quantified the uncertainty in my forecast, so there's less in my decision? Or does the uncertainty in the decision ever dominate uncertainty in the forecast? I wondered what your perspective was on that. Thank you.
I will give my personal answer to that, and it's a little bit biased by the stuff I work on and stuff I study. I think once you've conveyed the uncertainty related to a decision, it's about the planning and arriving prepared for the decision. Once you've articulated it, you can put together a plan. You can put together mitigation strategies. You can put together contingencies that allow you to psychologically and otherwise deal with the uncertainty better, okay? And so if you've compared options, you've chosen a course of action with a certain risk profile or with a certain degree of risk, you can at least plan for it and put together plans that will allow you to cope and digest it. And that means that you fully absorbed it, okay? If you see people taking actions, for instance, the fact that they were practicing in a certain way to de-risk the option that they chose allowed them to really arrive prepared, but it also signaled that they understood how complex it was going to be. With the players, it's the same kind of idea, is that when you select a certain set of players that have certain profiles and probabilities of being rock stars and superstars, you can actually blend them and combine the best team possible because you're looking for a different set of profiles of individual players, okay? So I think it's about the planning. Once you've taken action and you know the uncertainty that you're facing, it's not that you ignore it, it's that you actually embrace it, and there's some signs that show that you have embraced it fully, okay? But great question, good. Another question here? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. You talk about options in the second case, and you talk about the NFL players, soccer players in the first case. My question is, I know that many football clubs also choose potential players based on their infrastructure and investments. So even though, I don't know, this is a question, I don't know how you did the simulations. Did you consider the endogeneity in your simulations, how their infrastructure and also investments will impact the potential soccer players? Because I'm from Turkey, and we have soccer clubs, and they choose specific players based on their infrastructure, even though dietitians are very important.
Yeah, so the simulations that we did and the expression of uncertainty that we conveyed with our models at this stage of the project only utilized information related to the scout assessments. We did not infuse other externalities such as other investments or other interventions that could take place. You could layer that on top of it. We looked just using the historical information that we had, which was scout assessments and basically percentage of cap of the second contract. So we just express the uncertainty as it comes from the scout assessments, given the realizations that we have, and some of it is embedded in there, so some of it is going to appear in the data in any event, but you could layer that on, but we did not. So what I showed you did not have that, but it's a good thing to include. Okay, yep, another question.
In relation to the NFL work that you did, do you see any of the results? Did the team pick more superstars due to the decision, the data that you provided?
We'll find out. It's still too early in the process to tell, but it's a good question. It will take us a while to see because this is fairly recent work, and recent drafts we will only find realization in a few years. So, but it's a great question. Yeah, I do, but yeah, I can't talk about it. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. A lot to think about. Thank you a lot. About the NFL project, how do you feel that you have censored data? Because you only see the result of hired players, right? So you only see the results of hired players.
We also see the players with no contract. So we see also the players that didn't get a second contract. So we see a mix. So we have the uncensored data in some way. Okay,
so the data is after the draft, they hire them, and then you look.
And then we see their second contract a few years. So there's quite a longevity in the data set.
Okay, but the first time hired players, that's already a censoring, right? So you already get better players due to the draft.
Yes, correct. So at the draft level, yes, that's true.
All right, but I think just one last question. Okay, just one last.
Sure. Oh, there's a chat. Okay, good. Yep.
Thank you. Was there a downside probability requirement for a superstar by your team? In other words, was there a minimum probability of being a superstar that your team considered?
Not that I know, but that's a great question. And that's something that goes back to the threshold idea that you could create these thresholds to say, I will only draft players that have a minimum percentage of chance of being a superstar. Not to my knowledge, they didn't do that, but that's what you can use that kind of probabilistic information for. There's one final chat question that I'll read out. So there was a question online from Paula to say, in the cave example, the process of choosing the order of exit among the boys, there's a lot of uncertainty there in terms of the fitness of the boys. They were younger and older boys, and they have different physique. This is maybe not so much addressing the uncertainty, but what happened was that Dr. Richard Harris went in there. He spent quite a few hours there chatting with the boys even the days before. He got to know them. And he decided for morale, and maybe this does deal with the uncertainty to some degree, for morale purposes, he let them choose. And the way that the boys chose who was going to go out was who lives the furthest from the cave, because they wanted to make sure that those who have they thought they were going home, right? Like they thought, they all went to the hospital and they were being monitored and made sure that they were okay, but they thought they were just going to get on their bikes and go home. So they chose the order of rescue based on how far they live from the cave. So I don't know, Paula, that totally represents the uncertainty, but empowering the boys to do it, I think maybe meant that they felt less nervous about it and more aligned with the process. But thank you, everybody, for your patience this morning, and have a great...
Yes, thank you very much, Yael, once again. We have to close this great plenary session. Really, thank you. That was great. Your adaptability, your energy was really good. So it's time to move on to the session, and see you around. Thanks a lot. Bye.